Your expert is Adam Jortner, the Goodwin Philpott Eminent Professor of Religion in the Department of History at Auburn University. He has lectured extensively on the history of religion and the imagination. His books include No Place for Saints, Blood from the Sky, and The Gods of Prophetstown.
What if the Soviets got to the moon first? What if the Constitution did not pass? What if the Allies lost World War II? What if? It might be one of the most important questions historians ask. History may tell us what happened, but asking what if creates a new lens to explore the past and its impact on the present.
It's easy to look at the world and think that it couldn't be any way other than the way it is right now. What if questions force us to think about possibilities. Could the world be different than the one we know? What would the implications of that be?
Asking what if gives us a sense of freedom. It gives us a chance to imagine different scenarios, and it gives us a chance to really think about what could be or what could have been.
Asking what if helps us to acknowledge that the past is not inevitable, and similarly, neither is our future.
History isn't written in stone. It's contingent upon numerous things that have the potential to change everything. A different person, a different decision, a different question could transform history as we know it. Counterfactual scenarios are more than games or science fiction. By looking at how things might have been, we get a better look at why things are. I'm Adam Jortner, and together with a panel of expert historians, I'm going to ask 10 of the biggest what-if questions in American history. We'll dive into questions of what didn't happen to understand what did happen. And why not start with the granddaddy of what-if questions in history? The Civil War is one of the defining moments for America, and the most famous battle of the war is Gettysburg. Could it have gone a different way? Would a different outcome have led to a different America? What kind of a world would it be if the Confederacy won? In this episode, I ask, what if Lee won at Gettysburg? It is 1863. Union and Confederate armies enter the second day of fighting at Gettysburg. At a hill called Little Round Top, a Union detachment shifts east, leaving Little Round Top undefended. The Confederates seize the hill as a place to mount artillery and proceed to cut the Union army to pieces. The Union line collapses, another in a long series of Union defeats. 10 days later, when draft riots break out in New York City, dozens of New York regiments in the disaffected Union Army desert. Rioting spreads. The Confederate Army continues to harass the reduced Union forces before heading back to the Confederate States in October. A stalemate ensues. Lincoln loses the 1864 election, and a negotiated peace secures the independence of the Confederacy. France brokers peace talks that secure independence for the Confederacy in exchange for Confederate support of French interference in Mexico. France uses the slaveholding republic as a buffer zone, while the French-Confederate partnership pushes abolitionist Britain and Free Soil Union into an alliance. So when France declares war on Prussia in 1870, Britain, the United States, and the Confederacy are drawn in to a world war. All because the Union failed to hold Little Round Top. In the actual Battle of Gettysburg, the Union Army really did abandon Little Round Top, only to have a motley crew of various different units rush in to defend it at the last moment. They probably saved the Union Army. But why bother asking about what if Little Round Top had fallen to the Confederates? After all, we know the Union won the Battle of Gettysburg. We know the Union won the Civil War. But do we know why? can we determine which factors made a difference? Can we recreate the fluid situation in the middle of battle, what the armies, commanders, brigades, and others saw and experienced moment by moment, and the choices those people had to make, and the consequences of those choices? And here's the thing. This doesn't just happen in battles. Everyone is constantly evaluating choices and making decisions. Different choices yield different outcomes. Politicians, writers, explorers, and ordinary people all make decisions that shape history. But we often can't see that unless we ask, what if they made another choice? When historians ask these questions, they're called counterfactuals. A well-constructed counterfactual question isn't just a guess, and it isn't about any old decision. We look for moments of contingency, times when something unlikely happened, or when events turned on something that could have gone either way. The goal here is to see if anything would change. As the historian Gary Kornblith argues, counterfactual questions allow us to determine which factor or factors, if taken away, made the difference. What ifs tell us about historical causation, and they also tell us the stakes of a particular historical decision. So, what were the stakes at Gettysburg? In July 1863, Union and Confederate armies have been fighting for 2 years. Recently, the Confederates have scored a series of victories: the 7 Days Campaign, Second Battle of Bull Run, Chancellorsville. Morale in the Confederacy is high. Morale in the Union North plummets. Disaffection is also underway in the North because President Lincoln makes the fateful decision to enlist black men in the Army and make the Civil War a war for emancipation. Many white Northerners object. 2 weeks after the Battle of Gettysburg, New York really did riot over Lincoln's draft order. Just at this moment, General Robert E. Lee invades Pennsylvania, so his army could plunder supplies from the Union rather than forage and take goods from the Virginia home front. In the words of historian James McPherson, Lee's invasion became a gigantic raid that stripped clean a large area of south-central Pennsylvania. Lee wrote that the invasion could exploit the peace party of the North as a means of dividing and weakening our enemies. As frustration and Union casualties mounted, a political faction emerged called the Copperheads, Northern politicians calling for peace talks and a ceasefire. As Lee explained to Confederate President Jefferson Davis, his plan was to make the war so damaging and unpopular that the Copperheads would get in a position to call a ceasefire, and once that happened, Lee and Davis believed the war would be over. So, Lee invaded the Union, where he found good evidence of Northern disaffection. Most of the black population of Gettysburg fled. The invading Confederates openly seized black people in Pennsylvania and sold them south into slavery. This was not hidden, and it was no accident. Gettysburg's black citizens fled north to Harrisburg. Gettysburg's other citizens did not hide them or design a collective defense. White citizens, noted theologian Philip Schaff, were too busy accusing each other of espionage and falling into political arguments over whose fault the invasion was. Lee's army saw the war weariness in Pennsylvania firsthand. The Confederates took the city of Gettysburg, but the Union forces there retreated to the hills beyond the town, where the main force of the Union Army, under General George Meade, joined them. Lee could have gone around them, but he decided to fight.
Meade is trying to find the Confederate army that is marching around Pennsylvania, and he's not exactly sure where they are. And Buford's cavalry on the first day run into some Confederate infantry. John Buford was an expert at sort of looking at terrain and recognizes this is a good piece of terrain to defend. This is a place we can hurt the Confederacy. And he uses a series of ridges that are running parallel to each other to fall back slowly, dealing damage to the Confederacy, slowing them so that the Union infantry has time to get there. And when the infantry eventually arrive, they're able to continue slowing the Confederacy, eventually falling back through the town of Gettysburg to Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill, which is perhaps one of the strongest positions that they could have found, giving them an advantage of height.
Virtually every decision made at Gettysburg has been subjected to what-ifs. Pickett's charge often comes up, but as dramatic as that moment is, it's not really contingent. Pickett's charge likely would have failed no matter how it played out. But one moment truly stands out as kind of a big accident. Little Round Top. On the second day of the battle, some Union divisions left Little Round Top to occupy slightly higher ground a half-mile away in a peach orchard. This left an opening. If the Confederates could get artillery up Little Round Top, they could have bombarded the Union lines from end to end. Union Army engineer Gouverneur Warren arrives on Little Round Top during the battle to check the signal station there, and he wonders, where are the troops? And oh look, there are a bunch of Confederate divisions heading this way. Warren tears down the hill, grabs whatever Union forces he can find, and gets the troops back onto Little Round Top 15 minutes before the Confederates arrive. There is a desperate struggle, and the Union defenders actually run out of ammunition. So they ran down on top of the Confederates with a bayonet charge and probably saved the Union Army.
If Little Round Top falls and Lee can turn the Union left flank, the South wins the battle, and that has big political implications. Yet another humiliation for the Union's Army of the Potomac. Yet another blow to Lincoln and his hopes for continuing to fight the war and bring the South back in. Lincoln is the leader of a democratic society. He has to win elections. And voters who see loss after loss after loss will start to ask, is this war worth it? After Gettysburg and after a Union victory, most Northerners thought this war is still worth fighting. If the battle goes differently, if Lincoln loses, more and more in the North would say, fine, let the South go. It's simply not worth the cost.
The victory at Little Round Top allowed the Union to hold its defensive position and to decisively repel the Confederates on the third day. It was not just the US and the Confederacy watching this battle. These armies did not fight in a vacuum. There's an international dimension to this fight. Britain is an abolitionist country, but one with economic ties to the Cotton South. And France? During the 1860s, while the Civil War is going on, France really did invade Mexico.
France was trying to build an empire in the Americas and saw the United States as an obstacle. If the US is divided, it makes France's path to an empire in the Americas that much easier. Lots of Americans celebrate Cinco de Mayo. Few of them actually know where it comes from. Cinco de Mayo is a Mexican victory against French imperialism. France was trying to build an empire in Latin America, a job that would have been a lot easier without the United States there to block it.
France, under Emperor Napoleon III, is actively pursuing an empire in Mexico. If it appeared that the Confederacy could defeat the North, France might have stepped in. But with Union victory at Gettysburg, that door shuts. The decisions at Gettysburg affect events in Mexico and Europe, and vice versa. That tells us there are more than just battlefield mechanics at work in this what if. If the defense at Little Round Top had failed, if Lee won at Gettysburg, the war wouldn't be over. Other moments of contingency outside the battlefield remain.
If Lee wins at Gettysburg, he's not in a position to conquer the North, but that was never the goal. If Lee wins at Gettysburg, the key effect is going to be political. A victory for Lee would put Lincoln in a very difficult position. Lincoln's got an election coming up in 1864, and there are large elements in the North that are starting to wonder if the war is worth fighting.
Why is Lee in Pennsylvania in the first place? Because he knows there is disaffection all over the Union and he is trying to exploit it. The overall strategy of the Confederacy was intended to break Northern morale. The New York City draft riots really did come just a few days after Gettysburg. Lincoln's decision to make emancipation a war aim likewise brought about urban riots. The Confederates hoped that with enough home front disaffection and enough defeats on the battlefield, the Union would either quit or elect someone besides Lincoln in 1864. Indeed, in August 1864, when Lincoln is running against the anti-emancipation Democrat George McClellan, even Lincoln wrote, "It seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards." Our battlefield what-ifs tell us that Gettysburg could have gone another way. But both armies understood this was not just a conflict about military positioning. Each army was trying to show the Union public that it was in control of the war. Each side wanted to show France that it was in control of the war. The Confederates are just trying to inflict psychological damage on the North. Yet because Little Round Top held, the Union Army enjoyed an important victory, more critical for the psychology and politics of the conflict than perhaps for its tactical brilliance. Civilian George Templeton Strong wrote, "The results of this victory are priceless, and that the Army of the Potomac has stood up nobly despite terrible failures. More importantly, Copperheads are palsied and dumb, for the moment at least." In Washington, President Lincoln received word of the victory at Gettysburg at almost the same time he heard that Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens was approaching Union lines to discuss a ceasefire. Lincoln sent Stephens away. It was a well-timed win, coming almost simultaneously with a victory at Vicksburg in the West, and just as the Union Army was enlisting black troops, whose own bravery and fierce fighting in the war really did change minds about emancipation within the Union Army. Over 100,000 black troops played an enormous role in shifting military fortunes of the North, but at the time of Gettysburg, they hadn't been in the field long. Northern morale still needed saving. The contingency of the outcome at Gettysburg has less to do with the immediate independence of a Southern Confederacy and more to do with the question of what would happen then. What would happen if the Union Army loses again? If the enemy army remains in Pennsylvania?
During the Civil War, Washington, D.C. was in an odd position. It was surrounded by Virginia, a Confederate state, and Maryland, a slave state that ended up on the side of the North. But the nation's capital was vulnerable. It was well defended, but a Lee victory at Gettysburg would at least open the possibility of a Confederate raid, maybe even the occupation of Washington, D.C. And that would have been a terrible blow to Lincoln's political prospects and increased the sentiment that said the war is simply not worth it.
Asking what if does suggest that the window for Confederate victory was narrow, but it was certainly possible. But victory at Gettysburg would not mean independence for the Confederacy. Any Southern victory would need to be followed up with more Union disaffection, probably a Lincoln defeat in 1864, and a political end to the war. And if France negotiated that peace in occupied Mexico, then the Confederacy would owe France. And when the Franco-Prussian War broke out in 1870, the French would have called in their debts.
If you have a victory by the Confederacy, you don't have U.S. history. You have North American history or Confederate history and U.S. history as separate topics. You have to deal with where are the boundaries going to be? Who gets what parts of the Mexican cession have to be negotiated? Will there be future wars between the two? How do you deal with runaway fugitives, enslaved people who continue escaping to the North? How do you deal with those who've already escaped to the North? How do you deal with those who served in the U.S. Army already?
Imagining an independent Confederacy is pretty scary. It's not all that comforting to know they would have had internal problems with enslavement and rebellions in territory, although all that might make them more likely to join in a French alliance. We need to be careful that our counterfactual speculations don't end up minimizing real historical tragedies by suggesting bizarre new maps or freaky outcomes. Most counterfactual histories tend to focus on a victorious Confederacy in the Civil War or a victorious Nazi Germany in World War II. Both of these are bad outcomes. And we shouldn't let the possibility of Confederate victory obscure the fact that a slaveholders' republic had already been destroying human lives for 80 years, and slavery in British North America had done it for 150 years before that. One way to do that is to let most of our focus fall on the actual moment of contingency, and to allow thinking about contingency help us see what factors made a difference. Remember, a contingent moment isn't any decision. A contingent moment occurs when what didn't happen was more likely than what did, or when the odds are no better than even. Look again at Little Round Top. Confederate regiments are moving towards an unguarded high point. One guy notices something is wrong and has to go grab a bunch of soldiers who were supposed to be doing other things and get them to defend the same spot in a rush job. If Warren is late, if people don't believe him, if he's sick that day, the Confederates walk up that hill. The Union Army retreats and Northern disaffection increases. What is the factor without which things would have been different? The forces at Little Round Top and Northern disaffection. Victory at Gettysburg helped allay that disaffection, and that is how Little Round Top saved the Union. As a contrast, we can look at another Gettysburg moment that's often pointed to as a what if: Pickett's charge. Lee famously ordered George Pickett to lead a charge against the center of the Union line on the third day, and many Confederates thought this was a moment they should have won. Instead, Pickett's charge got cut to pieces. But this really wasn't a contingent moment. By the time Pickett charged, the Union had tricked Lee into thinking their artillery was out of the fight. But it wasn't. So when Pickett charged, there wasn't much chance they would succeed. But as I said, it's not just battles that provide contingency. Indeed, one of the most important what-ifs about the Civil War doesn't involve the war at all. For example, what if Henry Clay won the election of 1844? I'm serious. In 1844, James K. Polk beat Clay for the presidency by about 5,000 votes in New York. Polk ran on a platform to annex the Republic of Texas, which would trigger a war with Mexico. Clay ran against annexation. Polk won, fought a war with Mexico, and annexed territory to the Pacific. The crisis that led to Lincoln's candidacy and secession focused on the expansion of slavery into those Mexican territories. But what if Polk lost? What if that election that turned on a hair's breadth had flipped to Clay?
What if you don't have the Mexican-American War? What if you don't have Texas become part of the United States? You don't have California enter as a free state, and you don't have to deal with these new territories coming in, and you don't have an 1850 compromise. Instead, there's no room left within the boundaries of the United States to continue expanding slavery. There's no institution of popular sovereignty, so presumably Kansas, under the Compromise of 1820, remains a free state, and there's no fight.
Had fewer Democrats made it to the polls in New York in 1844, Clay would have won. No Texas annexation, no Mexican War, no expansion of the U.S., and therefore no crisis over expanding slavery, no Lincoln, no secession, or at least no secession in 1860. The Civil War is so central to American self-understanding and our sense of history that it's mind-boggling to think that it might not have happened because of a few thousand votes in one city in 1844. We normally see history as natural and logical, but we know how things turned out. The people who lived through that history did not. We ask what if to get at the possibilities, to put ourselves in the shoes of the people of the time, to understand the choices they faced, to see how individual choices shaped American history, to see how strange things could have been, but also to see how unlikely our own world is, how it is shaped by mistakes, accidents, and choices. The past should seem amazing to us. It's jaw-dropping. The Constitution almost didn't pass. De Soto and the Spanish tried to conquer Alabama in 1521 and got demolished by Native Americans. A man walked on the moon in 1969.
Oh, it's beautiful, Mike. It really is.
We have to ask what if to get at the stakes they saw and how their decisions shifted and changed moment to moment in all sorts of situations, just like the chaos at Gettysburg. History is not a series of set pieces of development. It's a poem, not a flowchart. Only in retrospect does the wonder and strangeness disappear. Asking what if produces ideas and situations that seem bizarre, but are they any more bizarre than our own world? If we really want to know what happened, sometimes you have to ask what didn't happen. And that's what we'll do in this series.